Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Economics channel. Tonight we are going to follow a single, quiet thread. A thread spun from wool and silk and salt and spice that has stretched across deserts and oceans for thousands of years, tying distant strangers together long before any of them knew the other's name. Trade routes are one of the oldest inventions of civilization, older than empires, older than most religions, older than most languages still spoken today. Every road, every river current, every camel path across a dry basin was, in its own slow way, a promise that a stranger far away wanted what you had, and had something you wanted in return. Across the long span of human history, these threads have carried more than goods. They have carried ideas, diseases, alphabets, recipes, and entire religions from one shore to another, quietly reshaping the world, one exchange at a time. If you enjoy drifting off to stories like this one, consider leaving the video a like, subscribing to the channel, or leaving a gentle comment below. It helps this quiet corner of the internet keep going. For now, let your shoulders soften into whatever you are resting on. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow. One long inhale, one longer exhale, and let your thoughts drift loose, like a boat slipping its mooring. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Let's begin. Long before any road had a name, small bands of foragers were already trading. Obsidian tools carried hundreds of miles from a single volcanic outcrop. Seashells found in caves far from any coastline. Archaeologists have traced obsidian from a handful of sources to sites scattered across entire regions, meaning someone, generation after generation, was carrying it onward. No one alive at the time could have known they were the first link in a chain that would eventually wrap the globe. It is a quiet reminder that trade did not begin with money or writing. It began with the simple human instinct to carry something a little further than the last person had. 10,000 years ago, the first farmers began trading surplus grain for tools they could not make themselves. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, villages exchanged wheat, barley, and lentils for flint blades and polished stone axes brought from quarries many days away. A farmer with too much grain and not enough tools had every reason to trust a passing trader, even one from a village he would never visit. Trust, in this sense, was the very first currency, minted long before metal ever was. Even now, every trade still rests on that same fragile, quiet agreement between strangers. Imagine standing at the edge of a Neolithic village at dawn, watching a stranger arrive with baskets slung over his shoulders. He carries salt from a distant spring, wrapped carefully in woven reeds. Salt preserved meat through the winter, and a village without it faced a much harder season ahead. The stranger has walked for days, trusting that this unfamiliar village will trade fairly rather than simply take what he carries. There was no law to protect him, no contract. Only the shared understanding that a trader who cheated once would never be welcomed again. Reputation, long before writing existed to record it, was already the most valuable thing a trader owned. By roughly 5,000 years ago, the first true long-distance trade networks connected Mesopotamia to lands hundreds of miles away. Sumerian cities imported copper from what is now Oman, tin from as far as Central Asia, and cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon. Without copper and tin together, there could be no bronze. And without bronze, no tools strong enough to build the irrigation canals that fed these growing cities. A civilization's survival, it turns out, quietly depended on strangers hundreds of miles away agreeing to keep sending ore. Even the mightiest cities of the ancient world were only ever as strong as the roots that fed them. Clay tablets from the Sumerian city of Ur reveal something remarkably modern: itemized shipping records. Merchants recorded exactly how much barley, wool, or silver left port, and what returned in exchange, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus and left to harden in the sun. Some tablets even record disputes: a shipment that arrived light, a partner who delayed payment, a debt still owed after a merchant's death. Bureaucracy, in other words, was born not from a king's decree, but from a merchant's simple need to prove what he was owed. The oldest surviving paperwork in human history is, quite fittingly, an invoice. Imagine an Assyrian merchant, centuries later, packing a donkey caravan bound for a trading colony hundreds of miles across the Anatolian plateau. He carries tin and finely woven textiles, hoping to trade them for silver and gold at the other end of a journey that will take nearly 2 months. Along the way, there are tolls to pay, mountain passes to cross, and no guarantee that prices will not have shifted by the time he arrives. Some merchants grew wealthy this way. Others lost everything to a single bad season or a broken axle in the wrong pass. Every fortune built on a trade route was, in some quiet way, also a fortune risked. Around 4,000 years ago, the Indus Valley civilization was trading with Mesopotamia across the open waters of the Arabian Sea. Indus seals, carved with images of animals and undeciphered script, have been found among the ruins of Mesopotamian cities far to the west. These seals likely marked bundles of goods, a kind of ancient shipping label proving ownership across a journey of open water. Two civilizations, separated by a language neither could read, still managed to trust each other's stamped clay well enough to trade for centuries. A shared symbol, it seems, can sometimes bridge a gap that shared words cannot. Ancient Egypt built one of history's earliest trade expeditions, not by land, but along the length of the Nile and out into the Red Sea. Egyptian ships sailed south to the land of Punt, likely somewhere along the coast of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, returning laden with incense, ebony, ivory, and even live trees. Temple carvings from the reign of Hatshepsut still show these ships being loaded, their cargo painstakingly recorded by scribes who never once left the shore. The pharaohs who commissioned these voyages would never smell the incense burning in their own temples without the risk taken by sailors they would likely never meet. Even divine authority, it seems, still depended on ordinary men willing to sail beyond the horizon. The Phoenicians, sailing from a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Lebanon, became the great connectors of the ancient Mediterranean. From around 3,000 years ago, their ships carried purple dye, cedar wood, glass, and finely worked metal to ports from Cyprus to Spain, founding trading colonies as they went. Tyrian purple, extracted drop by drop from thousands of crushed sea snails, became so valuable that only royalty could afford to wear it. A single robe dyed this color could cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and the secret of its production was guarded jealously for centuries. Even color, it turns out, once had a price steep enough to define who ruled and who did not. Imagine a Phoenician captain navigating by starlight alone, far from any coastline, trusting nothing but the position of a single fixed star to bring his crew home. Greek writers later credited the Phoenicians with using this star more skillfully than any other sailors of their age, threading narrow straits and open crossings that most captains would not dare attempt. A single miscalculation could mean running aground on unknown rocks, or drifting for days with dwindling water in the hold. And yet, generation after generation, these sailors kept setting out, carrying the accumulated knowledge of the sea itself from father to son. Navigation, long before instruments existed to make it precise, was simply memory passed quietly down a family line. By the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire had built one of the ancient world's most remarkable trade arteries, the Royal Road. Stretching some 1,500 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in modern-day Iran, it was punctuated by way stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart. A relay system of mounted couriers could carry a message the entire length of the road in about a week, a speed unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. Merchants traveling the same road for trade alone might take 3 months to cover the same distance on foot. A road built for kings and soldiers, it turns out, quietly became one of history's great commercial highways as well. Ancient Greece depended on trade in a way few land powers of the time did, since its rocky soil could not feed its growing cities alone. Athenian ships carried olive oil and fine pottery outward, returning with grain from as far away as the shores of the Black Sea. A poor harvest abroad, or a blockade at the wrong strait, could mean real hunger back home within a single season. The Athenians grew so dependent on this grain route that protecting it became one of their navy's most urgent responsibilities. A city famous for its philosophers and its marble temples still, in the end, lived or starved by the arrival of distant ships. Imagine the port of Piraeus at midday, its harbor crowded with merchant ships from a dozen different city-states, each one unloading amphorae stamped with the mark of its home region. Traders shouted prices in half a dozen dialects, while dock workers hauled jars of wine, oil, and dried fish onto waiting carts bound for the markets of Athens. Somewhere among the crowd, a single grain merchant's fortune might rise or fall, depending on news that had not yet arrived from across the sea. It was a place built almost entirely on trust, in information that was, by necessity, always a little out of date. Even in antiquity, a trader's greatest asset was simply knowing something before his rivals did. Around the 2nd century BCE, the network later called the Silk Road began to take a recognizable shape between Han Dynasty China and Central Asia. A Chinese diplomat named Zhang Qian, sent westward to find allies against nomadic rivals, instead returned with detailed reports of unfamiliar kingdoms rich in horses, grapes, and unfamiliar goods. His mission had failed at its original purpose entirely, yet it opened the door to a trade network that would eventually stretch thousands of miles. Sometimes, it seems, the most consequential discoveries are made while searching for something else entirely. A diplomatic failure, quietly, became one of history's great commercial beginnings. Silk itself was so carefully guarded a secret in ancient China that revealing its production process to outsiders was, for a long stretch of history, punishable by death. Only the imperial court and select artisans understood the full process of coaxing thread from the cocoons of silkworms feeding on mulberry leaves. Foreign buyers paid extraordinary sums for the finished cloth without ever learning how it was made, sometimes guessing it grew on trees or was combed from strange desert insects. It would be centuries before the secret slipped past China's borders, carried, according to legend, hidden inside a hollow walking staff or woven into a princess's headdress. A single thread, kept secret long enough, can shape the economy of half a continent. Imagine a caravan of 200 camels crossing the Taklamakan Desert, their bells ringing softly in the dry wind, guided by merchants who had memorized the location of every oasis by heart. A wrong turn here could mean days without water, and the desert's own name was said by local travelers to mean, roughly, the place you enter but do not leave. Yet caravans crossed it for centuries, resupplying at walled oasis towns that grew wealthy purely from selling food, water, and shelter to passing traders. These small desert towns, though rarely powerful in their own right, became indispensable simply by sitting in the right place at the right time. Geography, more than any army, decided which towns would prosper along this route. The caravanserai, a fortified roadside inn found across the Silk Road and the wider Islamic world, became one of history's most practical trade inventions. Built roughly a day's journey apart, these walled compounds offered merchants, camels, and goods safe shelter overnight, along with stables, storage rooms, and sometimes a small mosque. A merchant who might not share a language, a religion, or a homeland with the innkeeper could still expect the same basic hospitality every single night of the journey. In this way, the caravanserai created something remarkably rare in the ancient world, a predictable island of safety strung across thousands of miles of uncertain territory. Even strangers, it turns out, can build a shared system of trust, one roadside inn at a time. By the height of the Silk Road's use, goods moving along it rarely, if ever, traveled its entire length in a single merchant's hands. A bolt of silk might change owners a dozen times between a workshop in China and a market in Rome, each merchant carrying it only a portion of the way before selling it onward. No single trader ever saw the full route from end to end, and most had only a vague sense of where the goods they sold had truly come from. Rome, at the far western end of this chain, imported vast quantities of Chinese silk without its merchants ever meeting a single Chinese producer. The world's economies, even then, were quietly interconnected by people who would never meet each other face to face. Imagine a Roman senator's wife receiving a bolt of shimmering silk, unaware that it had passed through the hands of Bactrian traders, Parthian middlemen, and Central Asian caravan masters before ever reaching her villa. Roman writers complained bitterly that silk drained the empire's silver reserves, calling it an extravagance that weakened Roman virtue and enriched distant, unseen strangers. And yet the demand for it never slowed, no matter how many senators wrote disapproving essays about its cost. Luxury, it seems, has always been easier to criticize in public than to resist in private. Desire, quietly, has often outpaced even the strongest moral arguments against it. The Roman Empire's own trade network reached far beyond the Mediterranean, with Roman coins turning up as far away as archaeological sites in southern India. Roman merchants sailed with the seasonal monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea, exchanging gold and wine for pepper, pearls, and fine cotton cloth. A voyage that once required years of coastal hugging could, once sailors learned to read the monsoon's rhythm, be completed reliably within a single trading season. Understanding a wind pattern, rather than any new ship or weapon, was what truly unlocked this ocean for regular trade. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs in trade come not from invention, but simply from patient observation of the natural world. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complained that trade with India, Arabia, and China cost Rome an enormous sum in precious metal every single year. He worried openly that the empire was hemorrhaging its wealth in exchange for silk, spices, and gemstones that, in his view, served no practical purpose at all. His complaints, preserved for centuries in his writing, reveal an anxiety about trade deficits that would sound familiar to economists many centuries later. Even in antiquity, Prosperity and unease about prosperity's cost seem to have always traveled together. A civilization's wealth, it seems, has rarely arrived without someone somewhere quietly worrying about the price. Trade along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean depended heavily on a scattering of small ports whose names rarely survive in popular memory today. Places like Berenice on Egypt's coast or Muziris on the southwestern shore of India once bustled with warehouses of pepper, ivory, and fine textiles awaiting the next ship. Archaeologists have found enormous quantities of broken amphorae and shipping receipts at these sites, evidence of trade on a scale historians once assumed was much smaller. An entire ancient economy, in other words, has had to be rediscovered almost entirely through broken pottery and forgotten paperwork. History, it turns out, often survives best in the objects that were simply thrown away. Imagine a Tamil merchant standing on the docks of Muziris, watching a Roman ship lower its cargo of wine and coral in exchange for sacks of black pepper destined for tables across the Mediterranean. Roman writers described pepper as being worth nearly its weight in silver by the time it reached distant markets far from its source. For the merchant on the docks, pepper was simply a local crop. For the buyer 3,000 miles away, it was an unimaginable luxury. Distance itself, it seems, has always been one of the most reliable ways to inflate the value of an ordinary thing. What is common in one place can, given enough distance, become precious in another. As Rome's Western Empire declined in the 5th century, many of its long trade routes did not vanish, but simply reorganized around new centers of power. Byzantine Constantinople, sitting astride the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, inherited much of the old Mediterranean trade and grew extraordinarily wealthy from tolls and taxes on passing goods. Silk, spices, and grain still moved along familiar routes, only now the profits flowed toward a different capital and a different emperor. Empires rise and empires fall. Yet the routes themselves, worn into the landscape by centuries of footsteps and cartwheels, tend to endure far longer than any single ruler. Geography, in the end, often outlasts politics. By the 7th century, the rise of Islam brought a new and remarkably unified trading world, stretching from Spain to the borders of India. A single legal and commercial framework, along with a shared language of trade in Arabic, allowed merchants to move goods and credit across an enormous span of territory with unusual ease. A merchant in Baghdad could write a letter of credit honored by a trading partner in distant Cordoba without a single coin physically crossing the intervening desert. This early form of paper credit, called a sock, is very likely the distant ancestor of the modern word check. A small piece of paper, trusted enough, has always been able to travel faster and safer than a chest of gold. Imagine the covered markets of Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, their stalls stacked with goods gathered from 3 separate continents: porcelain from China, spices from India, furs from as far away as the Baltic coast. Baghdad's position, where 2 great rivers nearly meet, made it a natural gathering point for caravans and river barges alike. Scholars in the city's libraries studied and preserved Greek, Persian, and Indian mathematics alongside the ledgers of its merchants, in a city where commerce and learning grew up side by side. A marketplace, it turns out, can be just as fertile a ground for new ideas as any university. Where goods flow freely, knowledge has a habit of quietly flowing right alongside them. The trans-Saharan gold and salt trade, connecting West Africa to the Mediterranean world, became one of the medieval era's most astonishing exchanges. Camel caravans crossed the desert carrying slabs of salt, mined from dry lake beds, southward to be traded for gold dust mined deep in the forests of West Africa. In some accounts, gold and salt were exchanged in West African markets at nearly equal weight, a reminder that value depends entirely on what a place happens to lack. A substance as ordinary as salt, scarce in the wrong place, could be worth as much as the most precious metal on earth. Scarcity, far more than substance, has always been what truly decides a thing's worth. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in the early 14th century, became legendary across the medieval world for a single journey rather than any battle. On his pilgrimage to Mecca, he reportedly traveled with an enormous retinue and so much gold that his spending in Cairo caused the value of gold there to fall sharply for years afterward. Mapmakers in Europe, hearing tales of his wealth secondhand, began drawing Mali on their maps holding an enormous golden nugget, marking it as one of the richest kingdoms on earth. A single lavish journey, retold and exaggerated across 2 continents, quietly reshaped how an entire empire was understood far beyond its own borders for generations. Reputation, once set loose along a trade route, can travel even further than the goods themselves. Imagine the West African city of Timbuktu at the height of its wealth, its mosques built of sun-dried mud brick, its libraries filled with manuscripts on law, astronomy, and medicine traded alongside gold and salt. Scholars traveled great distances to study there, drawn by a reputation for learning that rivaled cities far larger and far better known in Europe at the time. Timbuktu's wealth came not from producing gold itself, but from sitting exactly where the desert caravan routes met the navigable waters of the Niger River. A city's fortune, it turns out, has often depended less on what it makes than on where it happens to sit. Position, quietly, has always been its own form of wealth. Across the Indian Ocean, a very different kind of trade network relied not on camels or caravans, but on a single, dependable seasonal wind. Arab, Indian, and later Chinese sailors learned to time their voyages to the monsoon, sailing outward on winds blowing one direction for half the year and returning on winds reversing for the other half. A merchant who understood this rhythm could plan a round trip with startling precision, sometimes down to the very week. Entire fortunes and entire fleets were built around trusting a wind that never once broke its ancient promise. Nature, patiently observed over centuries, can become as reliable as any human-made schedule. Dhows, the traditional sailing vessels of the Indian Ocean, were often built without a single iron nail, their wooden planks instead stitched together with cord made from coconut fiber. Sailors believed, according to some accounts, that iron nails might be pulled from the hull by underwater magnetic rocks rumored to lie along certain stretches of coast. Whether or not the belief was accurate, the stitched hull design gave these ships a flexibility that let them survive collisions with coral reefs that would have shattered a rigidly nailed hull. Sometimes a superstition and a genuinely useful engineering choice happen to point in exactly the same direction. Old knowledge, however strangely explained, often still carries a grain of hard-won practical wisdom. Imagine a Chinese admiral named Zheng He commanding a fleet of enormous treasure ships in the early 15th century, some reportedly longer than a modern football field, sailing as far as the eastern coast of Africa. His voyages carried porcelain, silk, and gold outward, returning with giraffes, exotic spices, and formal tribute from distant kingdoms eager to trade with China. Within a few decades, A change in imperial policy halted these voyages entirely, and the Great Fleet was left to rot in harbor rather than sail again. An entire era of exploration can end, it turns out, not through disaster at sea, but simply through a change of mind back on shore. The tide of history, like the ocean itself, can turn quietly and without warning. In medieval Europe, a very different network of trade quietly took shape among cities ringing the cold waters of the Baltic and North Seas. Beginning in the 12th century, merchant guilds from northern German towns began cooperating to protect shared trading interests, eventually forming what became known as the Hanseatic League. Member cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges pooled resources to fight piracy, negotiate trading privileges, and even wage small wars when a foreign ruler threatened their commercial interests. A network of merchants, rather than any king or emperor, effectively governed trade across an enormous stretch of northern Europe for several centuries. Sometimes the strongest form of unity comes not from a crown, but from a shared ledger. The Hanseatic League's trading posts, called contours, operated almost like small independent territories inside foreign cities, with their own laws, warehouses, and living quarters for resident merchants. The contour in London, known as the Steelyard, stood for centuries along the banks of the Thames, a walled compound where German merchants lived, worked, and settled disputes under their own league's rules. English merchants often resented these privileges, and tensions occasionally spilled into open conflict between local traders and the well-organized foreign guild. Trade, even at its most cooperative, has rarely been entirely free of friction between those who benefit and those who feel shut out. Prosperity for one group has often quietly meant resentment brewing in another. Imagine a Hanseatic cog, a sturdy, flat-bottomed cargo ship working its way along the Baltic coast, loaded with barrels of salted herring, furs, and timber bound for southern markets. Herring alone, preserved with salt from Hanseatic saltworks, fed much of medieval Europe during long winters and religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. A single good fishing season, properly preserved and shipped, could feed entire regions that had no coastline of their own. A humble, silvery fish, caught and salted correctly, quietly became one of the most important commodities of the medieval world. Sometimes history's great trade goods are not gold or silk at all, but simply something everyone needs to eat. Venice, built improbably on a lagoon of mudflats and marshland, became one of the wealthiest trading powers in medieval Europe through sheer commercial persistence. Venetian merchants controlled much of the trade in spices, silk, and glassware arriving from the eastern Mediterranean, reselling these goods at considerable profit throughout the rest of Europe. The city's glassmakers, working on the island of Murano, guarded their techniques so closely that leaving the island to practice elsewhere was, for a time, treated as an act of treason. A city with almost no natural resources of its own became one of the richest places on earth purely by controlling the movement of other people's goods. Wealth, it turns out, does not always require producing anything at all. Sometimes it only requires standing in the right place along the way. Marco Polo's account of his travels along the Silk Road to the court of Kublai Khan, written in the late 13th century, introduced medieval Europe to a China wealthier than most readers could easily believe. His descriptions of paper money, coal used for heating, and enormous, well-organized cities struck many European readers as pure fantasy rather than honest observation. Some contemporaries reportedly nicknamed his book The Million Lies for its seemingly exaggerated claims about the scale of Chinese wealth and infrastructure. It would take centuries and further contact before Europeans widely accepted that much of what he described had, in fact, been true all along. Sometimes the plain truth about a distant land is simply too large for a nearby mind to accept at first telling. Imagine a 14th century European reader huddled by candlelight, turning the pages of Marco Polo's account and trying to picture paper currency backed not by gold, but by the word of an emperor thousands of miles away. In much of Europe at the time, coins still needed to contain real silver or gold to be trusted at all. The idea that a simple piece of paper could hold real value purely because a powerful authority said so seemed almost impossibly strange. It would take European economies several more centuries to build the same kind of trust in paper that Chinese markets had already mastered. Trust, once again, proves to be the real currency beneath every other currency ever invented. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, is now widely believed to have traveled westward along the very same trade routes that carried silk and spice. Fleas carried by rodents aboard merchant ships and caravans spread the plague from Central Asia to Mediterranean ports within a matter of months.
Entire towns were devastated. Trade itself slowed to a crawl for a time, and merchants were sometimes viewed with suspicion simply for having recently traveled.
It is a sobering truth that the same routes binding the world together in prosperity could, just as easily, bind it together in tragedy. Connection, throughout history, has always carried both gifts and burdens along the very same road. In the aftermath of the plague, surviving merchants and workers found their labor suddenly more valuable, since there were simply fewer people left to do the same amount of work. Wages rose across much of Europe in the following decades, and some historians argue this shift quietly loosened the rigid social structures of the earlier medieval period. A catastrophe that killed a vast portion of Europe's population also, unintentionally, improved the bargaining position of many who survived it. History rarely offers a clean lesson, and this one is no exception. Genuine tragedy and genuine unintended opportunity arriving together in the very same century. Even the darkest chapters of trade history carry threads that, quietly, wove towards something new. Imagine a Genoese merchant in the early 15th century staring out at a Mediterranean now crowded with rival Venetian ships, wondering whether there might be another way to reach the riches of the East entirely by sea. Overland routes through Central Asia had grown less reliable as the vast Mongol trading peace of earlier centuries fractured into smaller, less stable territories. Tolls, taxes, and outright banditry along the old Silk Road made goods more expensive with every passing decade. It was this very frustration, felt by merchants and monarchs alike, that would soon send a small number of ships out into open, uncharted water. Sometimes, a closed door quietly becomes the reason someone finally builds a window. By the late 15th century, Portuguese sailors, funded by a crown eager to bypass the costly overland spice routes, began pushing steadily down the coast of West Africa. Prince Henry, later remembered as the Navigator, sponsored decades of voyages that slowly mapped a coastline Europeans had never charted before. Each voyage pushed a little further south than the last, gradually proving that the ocean did not, as some had feared, simply boil near the equator. Fear of the unknown, it turns out, can be worn away not by courage alone, but by patient, incremental progress, one voyage at a time. Even the greatest journeys in history are usually made of very small, careful steps. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama finally reached the Indian coast by sailing entirely around the southern tip of Africa, opening a direct sea route between Europe and Asia. His arrival stunned local merchants at the port of Calicut, who had never before seen European ships sail directly into their waters. The voyage had taken nearly a year and cost the lives of many of his crew, yet it promised to cut out the many middlemen who had taxed goods at every stage of the old overland routes. A single sea voyage threatened to quietly unravel trading arrangements that had stood for centuries across half the known world. Sometimes a new road does not simply add to the old ones, it slowly makes them obsolete. Imagine the spice markets of Lisbon in the years following da Gama's voyage, suddenly filled with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves that had bypassed Venice and the old overland routes entirely. Prices for these spices, once astronomically high across much of Europe, began to fall as Portuguese ships brought them home in far greater quantity than ever before. Venetian merchants, who had grown wealthy controlling the old Mediterranean spice trade, watched their profits shrink as buyers turned toward the new Atlantic route instead. An entire city's fortune, built over centuries, could be quietly undercut by a single successful voyage taken by a rival kingdom. No trading advantage, however old or well established, has ever proven entirely permanent. Christopher Columbus's westward voyage in 1492, originally intended to find a new route to the same spice markets of Asia, instead stumbled upon lands entirely unknown to Europeans. He remained convinced until his death that he had reached the outer islands of Asia, rather than an entirely separate continent unfamiliar to the old maps of his time. The voyage's original commercial goal was, in a very real sense, a complete failure, even as it opened trade routes to two continents no European had previously mapped. Sometimes, the most consequential trade routes in history are opened entirely by accident, in pursuit of a destination never actually reached. History, it seems, often rewards a wrong turn as generously as it rewards a right one. The so-called Columbian Exchange that followed sent crops, animals, and diseases flowing in both directions across the Atlantic for the first time in human history. Potatoes, maize, and tomatoes traveled eastward to Europe, while horses, wheat, and sugarcane traveled westward to the Americas, permanently reshaping diets on both sides of the ocean. European diseases, to which indigenous peoples of the Americas had no prior immunity, traveled alongside these goods with devastating and lasting consequences for entire populations. It remains one of history's most sobering reminders that trade routes carry harm as readily as they carry abundance. A single ocean crossing, in this way, quietly rewrote the future of two entire hemispheres at once. Imagine a small Spanish port in the early 16th century, its warehouses filling with silver mined from the mountains of Peru and Mexico, waiting to be loaded onto treasure fleets bound across the Atlantic. This silver, mined largely through forced labor under brutal and exploitative conditions, financed much of Spain's growing empire and flowed onward into trade networks reaching as far as China. The human cost behind this glittering cargo was immense, borne overwhelmingly by indigenous and enslaved laborers who saw none of the wealth their labor created. It is a difficult truth of trade history that some of its greatest fortunes were built upon some of its greatest injustices. Remembering this cost honestly does not diminish history, it simply completes it. So much silver flowed from the Americas into global trade that a single Spanish coin, the silver real, became something close to the world's first truly global currency. It was accepted from ports in the Caribbean to markets deep inside Ming Dynasty China, where merchants prized its consistent silver content above locally minted alternatives. China's own economy, hungry for silver to back its paper currency, effectively pulled much of this American silver across the entire width of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. A coin minted in the mountains of South America might, within a few years, end up in the pocket of a merchant in southern China. Even in the 16th century, the world's economies were already more tightly bound together than most people at the time ever realized. The transatlantic slave trade, which grew alongside these same new Atlantic routes, forcibly transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas over more than 3 centuries. Ships often followed a triangular pattern, carrying manufactured goods to West Africa, enslaved people across the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage, and raw colonial goods like sugar and cotton back to Europe. This trade caused immeasurable and lasting human suffering, and its consequences echo through the societies it touched to this very day. Any honest account of trade route history must acknowledge that some of the routes most profitable to their operators were built entirely on human bondage. A calm retelling of history does not mean a dishonest one, and this chapter deserves to be remembered with the weight it truly carries.
Imagine a Dutch trading company clerk in the early 17th century, carefully recording the arrival of a ship loaded with nutmeg from a single small cluster of islands in what is now eastern Indonesia.
The Banda Islands were, for a time, the only known source of nutmeg on Earth, making them extraordinarily valuable to European trading companies eager for a monopoly. Control over these few small islands was, at points, considered valuable enough to fight over, trade for, and defend at enormous cost. It is a strange thought that a small, fragrant seed once shaped the foreign policy of distant European nations. Scarcity, once again, quietly decided what the wider world was willing to risk everything for. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became one of history's first great multinational trading corporations, issuing shares that could be bought and sold on a formal stock exchange in Amsterdam. Investors who had never seen a spice tree or set foot on a ship could still profit, or lose everything, based on the fortunes of distant voyages they would never personally witness. This arrangement spread the enormous risk of long ocean voyages across many small investors, rather than resting entirely on a single wealthy merchant or crown. The modern stock market, in a very real sense, was born out of the sheer risk and expense of sailing to the other side of the world. An invention meant to fund distant trade quietly became one of history's most lasting financial institutions. Imagine an Amsterdam merchant in the early 1600s, standing in a crowded courtyard exchange, calling out prices for shares in a company whose ships were, at that very moment, somewhere in the Indian Ocean. No one in that courtyard could know for certain whether those ships would return laden with profit or lost entirely to storm or conflict. Share prices rose and fell on rumor as much as fact, long before any ship's safe arrival could be confirmed by letter. Uncertainty, it seems, has always been the quiet price paid for the chance at extraordinary reward. Every modern stock exchange still carries, somewhere in its bones, the memory of ships that might never come home. The British East India Company, chartered in 1600, followed a similar path, eventually growing so powerful that it maintained its own private army larger than many national forces of the time. What began as a modest trading venture for pepper and textiles gradually expanded into direct political control over vast stretches of the Indian subcontinent. A private commercial company, answerable primarily to its shareholders rather than any single government, came to govern the lives of millions of people. It remains one of history's starkest reminders of how far a trading enterprise can drift from its original, modest commercial purpose. A company built to move goods can, over enough time, quietly become something closer to an empire. Tea, imported by British trading companies from China in ever-growing quantities through the 17th and 18th centuries, gradually transformed from a rare luxury into a daily household habit across Britain. By the late 18th century, tea consumption had become so widespread that the British government relied on tea taxes for a meaningful share of its total revenue. A drink once reserved for wealthy households in small porcelain cups had, within a few generations, become an everyday comfort for nearly every class of British society. Few trade goods in history have traveled so far, so quietly, into the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Sometimes the most powerful trade good of an era is not gold or silk, but simply a warm cup shared at the end of a long day. To pay for this growing appetite for Chinese tea, British trading companies increasingly turned to a far more troubling export: opium, grown in British-controlled India. Chinese authorities, alarmed by widespread addiction and the resulting drain of silver from their economy, attempted repeatedly to ban its import throughout the early 19th century. These tensions eventually erupted into open conflict, remembered today as the Opium Wars, fought largely to preserve one nation's profitable and deeply harmful trade. It stands as one of history's clearest examples of a trade route sustained not by mutual benefit, but by force and by harm knowingly inflicted. Even prosperous trading empires, history reminds us, have not always chosen their profits honorably. Imagine a caravan crossing the high mountain passes between India and Central Asia in the 18th century, carrying not spices this time, but bales of raw cotton bound for weavers in cities along the route. Cotton textiles, particularly the fine cloth produced in the Indian region of Bengal, were prized across markets from the Middle East to Europe for their quality and craftsmanship. European trading companies eventually sought to control this production directly, reshaping local economies to serve distant demand rather than local need. A skill perfected over centuries by local weavers gradually became subject to decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. Trade, once it grows powerful enough, has a quiet way of reshaping the very hands that first made a good famous. By the 18th century, the growing plantation economies of the Americas depended heavily on sugar, a crop that transformed the diets, economies, and, tragically, the labor systems of the entire Atlantic world. Sugar produced by enslaved labor in the Caribbean was shipped to Europe in vast quantities, feeding a growing taste for sweetened tea, coffee, and confections among ordinary households. What arrived in a European teacup as a small spoonful of sweetness represented, at its point of origin, an enormous and largely hidden human cost. It is worth pausing honestly on this truth, since so much of the comfort trade brought to some was paid for by the suffering of others. A calm, wide-lens view of history does not look away from this. It simply holds both truths at once. Imagine a small English coffee house in the early 18th century, its patrons discussing news, politics, and business over cups, sweetened with sugar and stirred with silver spoons imported from distant colonies. Coffee houses like these became informal centers of commerce themselves, where merchants gathered to share shipping news and strike deals over insurance for their vessels. One such gathering place, Lloyd's Coffee House in London, would eventually grow into one of the world's most enduring marine insurance markets. An ordinary cup of coffee, shared among merchants trading gossip, quietly gave rise to an institution that still insures ships crossing the oceans today. Sometimes the largest institutions in history begin at nothing more than a shared table and a pot of coffee. Marine insurance itself grew directly out of the dangers merchants faced along these long ocean trade routes, spreading the financial risk of a single lost ship across many willing investors. A merchant could pay a modest premium in advance, protecting against the catastrophic loss of an entire cargo to storm, piracy, or shipwreck. Without this innovation, few individual merchants could have afforded to risk an entire fortune on a single, uncertain voyage. Trade across dangerous, unpredictable oceans, in this quiet way, gave birth to one of the earliest and most enduring forms of financial protection. Even our fear of loss, carefully managed, has a way of building something lasting and useful. By the early 19th century, the age of sail was slowly giving way to steam, and trade routes that had depended on fickle winds for thousands of years began to depend instead on coal and steady engines. Steamships could hold to a schedule with a reliability sailing ships never could, arriving within days of a predicted date rather than weeks. This new reliability allowed merchants to plan far more precisely, reducing the guesswork that had shaped trade since its earliest days. An invention meant simply to move a ship forward quietly reshaped how confidently the entire world could plan its commerce. Even ancient uncertainties, given enough time and ingenuity, eventually yield to steady human persistence. Imagine the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. A narrow ribbon of water cut through the Egyptian desert, suddenly connecting the Mediterranean directly to the Red Sea and the trade routes of Asia beyond. Ships that once needed months to sail around the entire southern tip of Africa could now reach India in a fraction of the time. The canal's construction had cost immense labor and considerable loss of life among the workers who dug it, a cost too often left out of celebratory histories of its opening. A shortcut through the earth itself, in this way, carried both genuine wonder and genuine hardship in the very same channel. Even our greatest engineering triumphs deserve to be remembered honestly, cost and all. Railroads, spreading rapidly across continents through the 19th century, created entirely new trade routes cutting straight through terrain that rivers and roads had never conveniently reached before. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed across the United States in 1869, connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts in days rather than the many months a wagon crossing once required. Goods, mail, and people that once traveled at the pace of a horse now moved at the pace of steam and steel. A journey that had shaped and limited an entire continent's commerce for generations was, quite suddenly, rendered almost unrecognizable. Sometimes a single new road can compress what once felt like an immense distance into something almost intimate. Imagine a railway worker laying track across a remote mountain pass, aware that the line he was building would soon carry grain, cattle, and manufactured goods across distances that had once taken his own grandparents' generation months to travel. Many of these railroads were built through the labor of immigrant workers who faced dangerous conditions and little recognition for the routes they made possible. Their names rarely appear in the history books that celebrate the trade these railroads eventually carried. It is worth remembering, quietly, that behind every great trade route lies the labor of people history too often forgets to name. Every road, however grand its purpose, was built one plain, unglamorous day at a time. The telegraph, strung alongside many of these new railroads and, eventually, laid along the floor of the ocean itself, transformed trade in a way even steam engines had not. By the 1860s, A transatlantic cable allowed merchants in New York and London to exchange prices and orders within hours rather than the weeks a letter by ship once required. Markets on opposite sides of an ocean could, for the first time in history, react to the very same piece of news on almost the very same day. Information itself had finally begun to travel faster than any ship, camel, or train ever could. A single wire beneath the ocean quietly did more to connect distant markets than centuries of sailing ever had. By the late 19th century, refrigerated shipping allowed meat, fruit, and dairy to cross oceans without spoiling, opening entirely new trade routes for perishable goods that had never before survived a long voyage. Beef from Argentina and lamb from New Zealand could suddenly reach dinner tables in Europe, thousands of miles from where the animals had grazed. Farmers on opposite sides of the globe found themselves, quite unexpectedly, competing directly with one another for the very same distant customers. A single mechanical innovation had quietly turned the whole world into one shared marketplace for food. Even something as simple as cold air, properly managed, can redraw the map of who trades with whom. Imagine a grain elevator standing beside a rail line on the American prairie in the late 19th century, its towering silos holding wheat destined for ports thousands of miles away, and, from there, for bakeries across Europe. A single harvest on the open plains could, within weeks, influence bread prices in cities its farmers would never see. Global trade had, by this point, grown intricate enough that a good season in one hemisphere could quietly ease hardship in another entirely across the ocean. Distance had not disappeared, but it had grown thin enough that the world's fortunes were now genuinely tangled together. A single stalk of wheat, in this way, had become part of a conversation spanning the whole earth. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914 after decades of failed French attempts and enormous human cost, finally connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without the long detour around South America. Thousands of workers died during its construction, largely from disease, in a cost that historians still consider carefully alongside the canal's undeniable commercial benefit. Ships could now cross between oceans in hours rather than weeks, reshaping global shipping routes almost overnight. It remains one of history's clearest examples of a trade route whose convenience came bound tightly together with genuine human sacrifice. Even our most useful shortcuts, history quietly insists, are rarely free of cost to someone. Standardized shipping containers, introduced in the mid-20th century by an American trucking entrepreneur, transformed global trade more thoroughly than perhaps any single invention since the steamship. Before containerization, loading and unloading a cargo ship by hand could take a full week and enormous manual labor at every port along the way. With standardized steel containers, the same ship could be unloaded and reloaded in a matter of hours using cranes rather than human backs. Shipping costs fell so dramatically that manufacturing itself could now be relocated across the globe, wherever labor and materials happened to be cheapest. A simple steel box, it turns out, quietly rearranged the entire geography of the modern economy. Imagine a modern container ship gliding into a harbor at night, its deck stacked many containers high, each one a small sealed world of goods bound for shelves on the other side of the planet. A single one of these ships can carry more cargo than an entire fleet of merchant vessels from a century earlier. Somewhere inside those containers might be electronics assembled in one country from parts made in 3 others, destined for a store in a 4th. Trade routes today, though far faster and larger than anything the ancient world could imagine, still rest on the very same quiet foundation, a stranger somewhere, trusting that a promised good will actually arrive. The thread that began with a single trader crossing a desert on foot now circles the entire globe many times over, every single day. Air freight, developed through the 20th century, added an entirely new layer to global trade, allowing high-value or perishable goods to cross continents within a single day rather than weeks. Fresh flowers grown in one hemisphere can be sold, still fresh, in florists' shops on the opposite side of the world within about 24 hours. Diamonds, medical supplies, and urgent spare parts now travel routes that would have seemed like pure fantasy to merchants of even a century earlier. Speed itself, once measured in months and then in weeks, is now sometimes measured in mere hours. And yet, however fast the vessel, the underlying exchange remains exactly as old as it ever was, someone offering what another person needs. The rise of global supply chains in the late 20th century meant that a single manufactured product might cross national borders many times before ever reaching a customer's hands. Raw materials mined in one country might be refined in a second, assembled into components in a third, and finally combined into a finished product in a fourth. A pause or disruption at any single link in this long, quiet chain could ripple outward, delaying deliveries on the opposite side of the world. Modern trade, for all its speed and technology, remains just as dependent on every link holding steady as the old caravan routes ever were. A chain, however long or modern, is still only as strong as its quietest, least noticed link. Imagine a shipping container quietly waiting at a modern port, its final destination logged not on a clay tablet or a paper ledger, but on a database updated automatically the moment it crosses each checkpoint. The technology has changed almost beyond recognition, yet the underlying question a merchant asks has not changed at all. Across 5,000 years, will this cargo arrive? And will payment follow safely in return? Every invoice, every satellite-tracked shipment, every automated customs form is simply the latest version of the same old promise between strangers. The thread first spun in a Neolithic village, carried by foot, camel, ship, rail, and now by container crane, has never actually broken. It has only ever grown longer and quieter and more woven into the ordinary fabric of everyday life. Far to the north, Viking traders in the 9th and 10th centuries built trade routes as impressive in their own way as any desert caravan, following rivers deep into what is now Russia and onward to Constantinople itself. Norse merchants, sailing shallow drafted longships suited equally to open sea and narrow river, carried furs, amber, and walrus ivory southward in exchange for silver, silk, and spices. Arabic silver coins, called dirhams, have been found buried in hoards across Scandinavia, evidence of a trade network stretching thousands of miles from its northern origin. The same ships famous for raiding coastal monasteries were, just as often, quietly engaged in ordinary, peaceful commerce along the very same rivers. History rarely divides so neatly into raiders and traders. Often, it turns out, they were simply the same sailors on a different kind of voyage. Imagine a Norse merchant portaging his longship overland between two rivers deep in the forests of what is now Russia, hauling it on log rollers with the help of local guides who knew the terrain by heart. This overland portage connected the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea and, eventually, to the markets of Constantinople itself. The journey was slow, exhausting, and occasionally dangerous, crossing the territory of unfamiliar peoples along every stretch of river. And yet merchants made this journey again and again, drawn by the silver and silk waiting at its far end. A route this difficult, repeated for generations, tells us plainly how much reward must have waited on the other side. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a very different kind of trade route had taken shape, not along rivers or deserts, but through a regular calendar of great trading fairs held across the Champagne region of medieval France. Merchants from Flanders, Italy, and beyond gathered at a rotating series of towns throughout the year, exchanging wool, cloth, spices, and, increasingly, credit and promissory notes. These fairs developed some of medieval Europe's earliest formal commercial law, including standardized weights, measures, and methods for settling disputes between merchants of different nations. A predictable calendar, rather than any single road, became the true backbone of this particular trading network. Sometimes a trade route is not a path across land at all, but simply an agreed and trusted date on a shared calendar. Imagine the bustling stalls of a Champagne fair in early summer. Cloth merchants from Flanders haggling with Italian bankers over the exchange rate between a dozen different regional currencies. Bankers at these fairs kept careful ledgers, allowing a merchant to deposit coin in one town and withdraw its value, minus a small fee, in another town entirely. This simple convenience meant merchants no longer needed to carry heavy sacks of coin along dangerous roads between fairs.
A ledger entry, trusted across hundreds of miles, had quietly begun to do the work that gold coins once had to do alone.
Paper and trust, once again, prove lighter and safer to carry than metal ever was. The Ottoman Empire, rising to power in the 14th and 15th centuries, eventually came to control one of history's most valuable pieces of trading real estate, the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. After Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces in 1453, the empire inherited and expanded a trading network that taxed goods flowing between Europe and Asia at a considerable profit. European powers, frustrated by these tolls and eager to avoid Ottoman middlemen entirely, had every incentive to search for alternative sea routes around Africa and across the Atlantic. In this quiet way, one empire's control over a narrow strait helped push an entirely different continent's sailors out into open, uncharted ocean. A single choke point on a map, it turns out, can reshape the destiny of nations that never even touch it. Imagine the Grand Bazaar of Constantinople under Ottoman rule. Its covered streets lined with thousands of individual shops selling carpets, spices, jewelry, and cloth, gathered from 3 separate continents. Merchants of many faiths and languages worked side by side under a shared system of guild regulation and imperial oversight that had endured, largely unchanged, for centuries. A shopper wandering these corridors might pass silk from China, coffee from Yemen, and porcelain from distant workshops, all within the same short walk. Few places on Earth, at the time, offered so complete a sample of the world's goods gathered under a single roof. A great trading city, in the end, is simply the whole world quietly folded into one walkable afternoon. In 1519, a Portuguese captain named Ferdinand Magellan set out with 5 ships, attempting something no expedition had ever achieved, sailing all the way around the entire globe. The voyage sought a westward route to the Spice Islands, hoping to avoid Portuguese-controlled waters to the east entirely. Magellan himself died partway through the journey in a conflict in the Philippines, and only one battered ship, carrying a fraction of the original crew, eventually returned to Spain 3 years later. The survivors returned not with vast riches, but with something arguably more valuable: definitive proof of the ocean routes connecting every corner of the earth. Sometimes, the true prize of a voyage is not the cargo it carries home, but simply the knowledge it proves possible. Imagine the Manila galleons, Spanish trading ships that for 2.5 centuries sailed a single yearly route across the Pacific between the Philippines and Mexico, carrying Chinese silk and porcelain eastward and American silver westward. This single route effectively linked Asia, the Americas, and Europe into one continuous chain of exchange for the very first time in history. A porcelain bowl made in China might travel by galleon to Mexico, overland by mule train to the Atlantic coast, and by a second ship onward to Spain, crossing nearly the entire width of the globe. The world, by this point, had become fully connected in a way no single earlier trade route had ever managed alone. The thread, by now, had finally wrapped all the way around. As European trading companies expanded their reach through the 17th and 18th centuries, they increasingly relied on chartered monopolies granted directly by their home governments. A single company might hold the exclusive legal right to trade with an entire region, backed by naval power and, when convenient, outright military force. Rival nations' companies frequently clashed over these exclusive claims, turning stretches of ocean and coastline into arenas of both commerce and open conflict. Trade and warfare during this period traveled together far more often than most history books find comfortable to admit. A monopoly, however profitable, has rarely been won or kept without some cost paid in conflict. Imagine a French trading post along the coast of West Africa in the 18th century, its warehouses stocked with cloth, firearms, and metal goods intended for exchange along routes stretching deep into the continent's interior. European traders rarely ventured far inland themselves, instead relying on established African merchant networks to move goods to and from the coast. These African trading partners held real economic power in these exchanges, setting terms that European companies were often obliged to accept. The old, simple story of trade as purely one-directional imposition rarely holds up against the more complicated, two-sided reality historians have since uncovered. Even under deeply unequal circumstances, trade has almost always required real negotiation on both sides of the table. By the late 18th century, growing debates over free trade began to reshape economic thinking across Europe, challenging centuries of assumptions about how nations should manage their commerce. The Scottish philosopher Adam Smith argued in his writing that voluntary exchange between trading partners tended to benefit both sides, rather than one side necessarily gaining only at the other's expense. His ideas, controversial at the time, slowly influenced policy across Britain and, eventually, much of the wider world. An idea written quietly in a study could, given enough time, reshape the trading habits of entire nations. Sometimes, the most powerful trade route of all is simply an idea, carried from mind to mind rather than port to port. In Britain, the Corn Laws of the early 19th century placed tariffs on imported grain, protecting domestic farmers but raising the price of bread for ordinary households across the country. Debate over these laws grew fierce, pitting landowners who benefited from protection against factory owners and workers who wanted cheaper imported grain. The laws were eventually repealed in 1846. A decision often remembered as an early landmark victory for the wider idea of free trade between nations. It remains one of history's clearest examples of how a single trade policy can quietly divide a nation's own interests against each other. Even within one country, A single trade route's rules can create as much disagreement as any dispute between rival nations. Imagine a 19th century textile mill in northern England, its machines spinning cotton grown thousands of miles away into cloth that would in turn be shipped back out across the ocean to markets old and new. The Industrial Revolution transformed trade routes from simple channels for finished goods into complex networks moving raw materials one direction and manufactured products the other. A single bale of raw cotton might cross an ocean, become cloth in a mill, and cross back over an entirely different ocean before reaching its final buyer. Trade, by this period, had grown into something closer to a continuous cycle than a simple one-way journey. The thread, quite literally in this case, now traveled the globe twice, before ever becoming a finished garment. By the early 20th century, submarine telegraph cables had grown into a truly global network, linking continents in a web of copper wire laid quietly along the ocean floor. A trader in Singapore could, within hours, learn the exact price a shipment of rubber was fetching in London, adjusting plans accordingly before a single ship had even left port. This flow of near-instant information reduced much of the guesswork that had defined trade for thousands of years before it. For the first time in history, the world's markets could genuinely be said to move, in a small way, together. Distance had not vanished, but the delay in knowing what happened across it had shrunk to almost nothing. The two world wars of the 20th century disrupted global trade routes more severely than almost any conflict before them, as naval blockades and submarine warfare made ocean shipping newly dangerous across entire regions. Merchant sailors faced real danger simply crossing waters that had, in peacetime, carried grain and goods without a second thought. Nations turned inward during these years, rationing goods and searching for substitutes for imports suddenly cut off by conflict. It is a quiet reminder that trade routes, however old and well established, remain only as safe as the peace surrounding them. Even the sturdiest thread can fray badly when the wider world around it is torn. Imagine the aftermath of the Second World War. Delegates from dozens of nations gathering to rebuild a global trading system shattered by years of conflict and economic isolation. Meetings held in the years that followed established new institutions intended to encourage steadier, more cooperative trade between nations moving forward. Tariffs that had once been raised sharply between rival trading blocs were gradually lowered through new, shared international agreements. A world exhausted by conflict chose, in this quiet way, to rebuild its trade routes around cooperation rather than rivalry. Sometimes, the clearest lesson history teaches is learned only after the hardest possible way of learning it. Through the second half of the 20th century, container shipping, air freight, and steadily falling trade barriers combined to create a global trading system of a scale and speed unimaginable to any earlier era. A factory built in one country could now reliably source parts from several others, assemble them, and ship a finished product to yet another continent within a matter of weeks. Consumers in distant countries grew accustomed to goods arriving from every corner of the earth, often without a second thought as to how far those goods had actually traveled. The great trade routes of the ancient world, once measured in months and years, had compressed into a system measured in days. The thread, spun so slowly across so many centuries, had finally learned to move at something close to the speed of thought. Imagine a quiet control room today, humming softly with the glow of screens, tracking thousands of ships and countless cargo containers as they move across every ocean on Earth at once. Each dot on that screen represents a small piece of the same ancient promise a Neolithic trader once carried across a valley on foot, that a stranger far away is waiting for what has been sent, and that trust, once again, will be honored. Software and satellites have replaced clay tablets and camel bells, yet the underlying rhythm of the exchange has not changed at all. Every era believes its own trade routes are entirely new, when really, each one is only the oldest idea in human history, dressed in whatever tools happen to be available. The thread endures, quietly, beneath every new invention laid across its path. As trade routes have grown faster and more interconnected, they have also grown more fragile in certain quiet ways, since a disruption at one distant point can now ripple outward across the entire system within days rather than months. A blocked canal, a delayed shipment, or a shortage of a single small component can slow deliveries on the far side of the world almost immediately. Modern trade's greatest strength, its tight interconnection, is also, in its own way, its most delicate vulnerability. It is a pattern as old as the Silk Road itself, where a single, unstable stretch of desert could just as easily disrupt an entire continent's supply of silk. Speed and fragility, it seems, have always traveled hand in hand along every great trade route in history, long before any of the great empires we have already spoken of tonight. Small river valleys were already quietly practicing a simpler kind of trade, one built around the rhythm of a single flooding river rather than any distant destination. Farmers along the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus exchanged surplus grain, fish, and reeds with neighboring villages long before any of them thought to call it commerce at all. A good flood meant more grain than one family could use, and a bad flood meant a neighbor's stored surplus might be the only thing standing between a village and true hardship. Trade, in its earliest and gentlest form, was simply neighbors quietly helping each other survive an unpredictable river. Even the grandest global trade network alive today still rests, somewhere underneath, on that same simple instinct to share what one village has too much of with another that does not. Imagine a small reed boat drifting down the Euphrates at dawn, loaded with baskets of dates and dried fish, its owner planning to trade quietly at the next village before the sun grows too warm. These small river exchanges, repeated daily across thousands of villages for thousands of years, rarely appear in any grand history book at all. And yet, taken together, they were the quiet, steady heartbeat beneath every larger trade network that would later rise upon this same river valley. The largest rivers of history, it turns out, were also its very first and gentlest trade routes. By roughly 4,000 years ago, the kingdoms of the ancient Near East had developed one of history's earliest known systems of diplomatic trade correspondence, preserved today on clay tablets uncovered at a site called Amarna in Egypt. Kings wrote to one another not only of alliances and marriages, but of overdue shipments of gold, timber, and horses, complaining when a promised gift arrived smaller or later than expected. Even between kings who addressed each other as brothers, trade disputes over quantity and quality were common, and at times remarkably petty. It is oddly comforting to know that even the mightiest rulers of the ancient world argued over shipments much the way any two modern merchants might. Grand titles and golden thrones, it seems, have never fully protected anyone from the small frustrations of a delayed delivery. Ancient China's own internal trade routes, well before the Silk Road stretched westward, connected the fertile river valleys of the north to the rice-growing regions of the south along a slowly expanding network of canals. The Grand Canal, begun in earlier centuries and greatly expanded under later dynasties, eventually stretched over 1,000 miles, linking the Yellow River to the Yangtze. Grain grown in the south could be moved efficiently northward to feed capital cities and armies that the northern farmland alone could never have sustained. An entire empire's stability, in this way, quietly depended on a canal rather than on any army at all. Sometimes the truest foundation of a great civilization is nothing more dramatic than a well-dug ditch, patiently maintained across many centuries. Imagine a barge loaded with rice gliding slowly along the Grand Canal, its crew poling steadily past fields, temples, and small towns that had grown up specifically to serve the canal traffic passing through. Toll stations along the route collected fees that funded further maintenance, creating a self-sustaining system that outlasted the very dynasties that first built it. Merchants along this canal built fortunes not from any single exotic good, but simply from the steady, reliable movement of rice, salt, and everyday necessities. Not every great trade route needs to carry something rare or precious. Sometimes the greatest fortune lies in reliably moving what everyone quietly needs every single day. Steadiness, in trade as in life, often outlasts glamour by a very wide margin. The kingdom of Aksum, rising along the Red Sea coast of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, became a major trading power in late antiquity, controlling routes linking the Roman world, Arabia, and inland Africa. Aksumite merchants exported ivory, gold, and incense, and the kingdom minted its own coinage, a rare achievement for a sub-Saharan African power of that era. Roman and Persian writers of the period listed Aksum among the great powers of the known world, a reputation later generations would largely forget. History's memory of who mattered and who did not has often been shaped less by actual importance than by which later civilizations happened to keep the best written records. A great trading kingdom can fade from common memory, even while the roots and coins it once commanded quietly reshaped an entire region. Imagine the port of Adulis on the Red Sea coast, ships arriving from as far as India and the Mediterranean, their holds exchanged for ivory tusks, tortoiseshell, and fragrant resin gathered from the African interior. Local merchants carried these goods inland, along routes known intimately to them, but rarely recorded on any map that survives today. So much of ancient trade, in truth, moved along paths that left no written record at all, remembered only in the goods that eventually surfaced in some distant market far away. History, in this quiet way, is often only the visible tip of a much larger and now silent network of everyday exchange. Trade between ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, entirely independent of the trade networks we have discussed across Africa, Europe, and Asia, developed along its own separate and remarkably sophisticated routes. Merchants known as Pochteca traveled established roads across the Aztec world, carrying cacao beans, quetzal feathers, jade, and obsidian between distant city-states. Cacao beans were valued so consistently that they were sometimes used directly as a form of currency in local marketplaces. An entire trading civilization rose, flourished, and developed its own merchant class and marketplace customs without ever once touching the trade networks of Europe or Asia. Human beings, it seems, invent trade wherever they gather, entirely independent of whether they know any other trading world exists. Imagine a Pochteca merchant setting out from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan before dawn, his back laden with goods, traveling established roads toward distant markets where his arrival was watched for and expected. These merchants sometimes doubled as scouts and informants for the empire, their trading journeys quietly serving political purposes far beyond simple commerce. A merchant's steady, familiar presence on a well-worn road, it turns out, has always made him useful for more than trade alone. Commerce and diplomacy, across nearly every civilization we have visited tonight, have quietly walked the very same road together. Long before European ships arrived, extensive trading networks already linked communities across the Pacific, with Polynesian voyagers navigating vast stretches of open ocean, using nothing but the stars, the swells, and the flight patterns of birds. Outrigger canoes carried obsidian, fine mats, and foodstuffs between islands separated by hundreds of miles of open water, guided by navigational knowledge passed down entirely by memory and oral teaching. Some of these voyages covered distances comparable to sailing across an entire ocean without any written chart at all.
An entire trading civilization was built on memorized knowledge alone, with no need for the maps or instruments other seafaring cultures relied upon.
The mind itself, carefully trained across generations, can hold a chart every bit as reliable as ink on paper. Imagine a Polynesian navigator lying flat in the bottom of a canoe at night, feeling the rhythm of ocean swells through the hull to judge direction long before any star had risen to confirm it. This skill, called wayfinding, allowed voyagers to cross enormous distances of open Pacific water with a confidence that still impresses modern sailors equipped with satellite navigation. Entire island chains were settled, and entire trading relationships built and sustained, purely on this quiet, patient mastery of the sea's own subtle signals. Sometimes the most advanced navigational tool in history has been nothing more than careful attention, passed from one patient teacher to one patient student. Trade along the Silk Road was never truly a single road at all, but rather a shifting web of parallel routes branching around mountains, deserts, and shifting political borders depending on the century. A closed pass in one decade might push merchants toward a longer but safer route further south, and a friendly new ruler might reopen a shortcut that had been closed for a generation. Merchants adapted constantly, carrying with them not just goods but detailed, hard-won knowledge of which routes were currently safe to travel. The Silk Road, in this sense, was less a fixed road than a living, breathing decision made fresh by every single caravan that set out. Even the most famous route in trade history was never quite as fixed or as solid as its name suggests. Imagine a caravan master consulting with fellow travelers at a desert crossroads, weighing rumors of bandit activity to the north against reports of a dried-up well along the southern path. These decisions were made with information that was often weeks old by the time it reached the crossroads, forcing merchants to weigh old news against fresh instinct. A wrong guess could cost a fortune or a life, while a right one might mean arriving safely with cargo still intact and prices still favorable. Every great trade route in history was, underneath its confident name, really just a long accumulation of individual, uncertain decisions made one crossroads at a time. Trade, at its heart, has always been an act of calculated courage rather than simple certainty. Beyond gold, silk, and spice, trade routes across history carried something far less visible, but arguably more transformative. The alphabet itself, along with numerals, religious ideas, and entire systems of belief. The Phoenician alphabet, carried along Mediterranean trade routes, became the ancestor of the Greek, Latin, and eventually most European alphabets used to this day. Buddhist teachings traveled eastward along the Silk Road, alongside silk and spice, taking root in China, Korea, and Japan, through the steady traffic of merchants and monks traveling the very same roads. A single trade route, in this way, could carry an entire belief system as easily as it carried a bolt of cloth. Ideas, it seems, have always traveled as freely as goods along the very same quiet paths. Imagine a Buddhist monk walking alongside a Silk Road caravan for safety and company, sharing stories and teachings with merchants during long, quiet evenings around a shared campfire. By the time these merchants reached their destination, they often carried home new ideas and new stories as readily as they carried new goods to sell. A caravan, in this sense, was never simply a convoy of cargo. It was also, quietly, a slow-moving library and a slow-moving temple, all traveling together. The most valuable cargo along any trade route may not always have been the cargo that could be weighed or sold at all. Numerals themselves traveled remarkable distances along trade routes, with the system of numbers many of us use today tracing its origins to ancient India before spreading westward through Islamic scholars and merchants. These numerals, often called Arabic numerals in the West, proved far more efficient for calculation and record-keeping than the older Roman numeral system many European merchants had relied upon. Merchants who adopted this new numeral system found it dramatically easier to track debts, profits, and shipments across long and complicated trading relationships. A simple change in how numbers were written could quietly transform how an entire continent conducted its business. Even the shape of a single digit, carried far enough along a trade route, can change the shape of an entire economy. The invention of double-entry bookkeeping in medieval Italy, closely tied to the needs of merchants managing increasingly long and complex trading relationships, transformed how businesses tracked their own success or failure. By recording every transaction twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, a merchant could catch errors and understand, at a glance, the true state of his affairs. This system, refined in the trading cities of Venice and Florence, would eventually become the foundation of modern accounting, practiced almost everywhere in the world today. A method invented to track shipments of wool and spice quietly became one of the most enduring intellectual tools in all of commerce. Even the humble ledger, it turns out, can outlive every empire that ever depended upon it. Imagine a Florentine merchant bent over his ledger by candlelight, carefully entering the arrival of a shipment of wool from England against the departure of dyed cloth bound for the Eastern Mediterranean. His careful columns of figures, balanced with quiet discipline every single evening, gave him a clarity about his own fortunes that most rulers of his era, managing far larger sums, entirely lacked. A simple habit of honest, careful recording proved, again and again throughout history, more valuable than any single lucky shipment ever could. Patience and discipline, quietly practiced, have always outlasted even the most fortunate stroke of trading luck. Banking families such as the Medici of Florence built extraordinary influence during the 15th century, not through conquest, but through careful management of loans, currency exchange, and trade financing across much of Europe. The Medici Bank operated branches in cities across the continent, extending credit to merchants, monarchs, and even the church itself. A family that began as modest wool traders eventually financed popes and princes, quietly shaping European politics through the simple leverage of unpaid debts. Trade finance, it turns out, can build a dynasty every bit as lasting as any born from a battlefield. Sometimes the quietest form of power is simply being the one everyone else happens to owe money to. Imagine a Medici bank clerk in Florence, carefully drafting a letter of credit for a merchant about to depart for Bruges, a single sheet of paper that would allow him to draw funds in a foreign city without ever carrying a single coin across the mountains. This system of trust, spanning branches hundreds of miles apart, relied entirely on the bank's reputation for honoring every document it issued. A single dishonored letter could unravel a reputation built over decades, and every clerk understood the weight that small piece of paper truly carried. Trust, once again, proves to be the quiet currency underneath every other currency history has ever invented. Coffee itself became a global trade good only in the 16th and 17th centuries, carried from its origins in the highlands of Ethiopia through Yemeni ports and onward into the wider Islamic world before eventually reaching Europe. Venetian merchants introduced coffee to European markets, where it was met at first with suspicion by some who considered it a strange, dark, foreign brew. Within a few generations, coffee houses had spread across European cities, becoming centers of conversation, business, and, as we heard earlier, even the birthplace of institutions like modern insurance. A single bean, carried patiently along trade routes for centuries, eventually reshaped the daily rhythms and even the architecture of cities that had never grown a single coffee plant themselves. What begins as a stranger's curious habit can, given enough time along the trade routes, become nearly everyone's quiet daily comfort. Imagine a Yemeni port in the 16th century, sacks of coffee beans stacked along the docks awaiting ships bound for Cairo, Istanbul, and eventually the distant, unfamiliar markets of Europe. For a time, the port city of Mocha gave its very name to the coffee that passed through it, a name that still lingers on menus centuries later. Few merchants loading those sacks could have imagined how thoroughly this single crop would eventually reshape mornings on the far side of the world. A trade route's true legacy is sometimes measured not in gold, but simply in the quiet habits it leaves behind in ordinary daily life. As trade goods multiplied across the early modern world, so too did the complexity of the taxes, tariffs, and customs duties that governments imposed upon them at every border and port. Customs houses sprang up wherever goods crossed a political boundary, each one employing officials whose entire livelihood depended on correctly assessing the value of passing cargo. Smuggling, naturally, grew alongside these taxes, as merchants sought quiet ways around duties they considered unfair or excessive. Wherever a trade route has ever crossed a border, it seems, an equally old and quiet second route has always existed just beside it, built entirely to avoid the toll. Regulation and evasion throughout history have traveled the very same road, only ever a few steps apart. Imagine a customs officer at a quiet European port in the 18th century, carefully inspecting barrels for hidden compartments, aware that a portion of every merchant's cargo likely never appeared on the manifest at all. Entire local economies along certain coastlines grew up almost entirely around the quiet, unofficial trade in smuggled tea, tobacco, and spirits. Governments lost meaningful revenue to this shadow trade, yet found it almost impossible to fully stamp out along coastlines too long and too quiet to patrol completely. Wherever there is a rule about trade, it seems, human ingenuity has always found some quiet gap along its edge. History suggests this particular pattern is unlikely to ever fully disappear. Furs became one of the most quietly valuable trade goods of the early modern world, driving expansion across the cold forests of Siberia and, eventually, across much of North America as well. Russian traders pushed steadily eastward across Siberia in pursuit of sable and other fine pelts, establishing trading posts along rivers that would, in time, connect an entire continent under a single expanding empire. Across the Atlantic, French and English traders built similar networks with indigenous nations across North America, exchanging metal tools and cloth for beaver pelts, destined for European hat makers.
Fashion in distant European cities, in this quiet way, reshaped economies and ecosystems on two entirely separate continents at once.
A single fashionable hat, worn in a city its wearer never left, could quietly ripple all the way to a frozen river thousands of miles away. Imagine a fur trading post deep in the Canadian wilderness in the 18th century. Indigenous trappers arriving by canoe with bundles of beaver pelts to exchange for kettles, blankets, and tools brought from across the ocean. These exchanges relied on careful, ongoing relationships built over years, since no single transaction alone could sustain a trading post through a harsh northern winter. Both sides, trader and trapper alike, depended entirely on the other honoring an agreement made many months earlier, long before either could know how the season's harvest would truly turn out. Even in the coldest, most remote corners of the trading world, the same quiet thread of mutual trust held everything together. Whaling, though less often remembered as a trade route in its own right, sent ships from ports in New England and elsewhere on voyages lasting years at a time, chasing whale oil across nearly every ocean on Earth. Whale oil lit lamps and lubricated machinery across much of the industrializing world before the later discovery and refinement of petroleum offered a cheaper alternative. A single successful voyage could return with enough oil to make a captain's fortune, while an unsuccessful one might mean years lost at sea for little reward at all. The risk these sailors accepted, venturing for years into some of the most remote waters on the planet, is difficult to fully imagine from the comfort of a warm bed. Even light itself, in an era before electricity, once depended on trade routes stretching across the loneliest stretches of ocean on Earth. Imagine a lookout high in the rigging of a whaling ship, scanning an empty horizon somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, having not seen land in many months. Life aboard these ships was slow, monotonous, and occasionally dangerous, built almost entirely around the patient search for a single valuable resource. Entire towns back home depended on the safe and successful return of these ships, their economies rising and falling with each voyage's fortune. A trade route, it turns out, does not always run between two fixed points. Sometimes it simply follows a resource wherever it happens to swim. Diamonds and other gemstones followed their own distinct trade routes through history, often moving quietly and discreetly compared to the loud publicity surrounding gold or spice. Indian diamond mines supplied much of the world's gem trade for centuries before new sources were later discovered in Brazil and, still later, in southern Africa. A single small stone, easily hidden and enormously valuable relative to its size, could cross borders and oceans with a discretion few other trade goods ever achieved. Some of history's most valuable trade routes, it turns out, were also its quietest and least visible. Not every thread in this larger story announces itself loudly. Some simply glimmer, quietly, in a merchant's closed hand. Imagine a gem trader in an 18th century port city, carefully examining a small pouch of uncut stones by lamplight, aware that its contents were worth more than an entire shipload of ordinary cargo. Such traders relied on close, trusted networks of buyers and sellers built over years, since a single stone's true value was often difficult for an outsider to judge at a glance. Reputation, once again, mattered more in this trade than in almost any other, since so much value could be hidden in something so small and so easily misjudged. The smallest cargo, carried carefully enough, has sometimes carried the largest fortunes in all of trade history. Wine and olive oil, staples of the ancient Mediterranean world, traveled such enormous distances in ceramic amphorae that broken shards of these vessels still litter the seabed along many ancient shipping lanes today. Archaeologists have mapped ancient trade routes almost entirely through the distribution of these broken amphorae, each style traceable to a particular region and era of production. A single shipwreck, undisturbed for 2,000 years, can reveal more about ancient trade patterns than an entire library of surviving written texts. The ocean floor, in this quiet way, has become one of history's most honest and untouched record books. Sometimes what a civilization threw away or lost tells us more than what it carefully chose to write down. Imagine marine archaeologists today gently lifting a 2,000-year-old amphora from a shipwreck off the Mediterranean coast, its shape and clay revealing exactly which region of the ancient world it once called home. Some shipwrecks have been found, still holding their original cargo, sealed by centuries of sand and silt, exactly where the ship finally came to rest. These wrecks offer an unfiltered snapshot of an ordinary trading voyage, frozen at the precise moment it went wrong. There is something quietly moving about a cargo that never reached its buyer, waiting patiently on the seabed for 2,000 years to finally tell its story. Even an unfinished journey, it seems, can still finish its own kind of story eventually. Porcelain, prized across trade routes stretching from China to Europe for its delicate beauty and remarkable strength, was for centuries a closely guarded technical secret understood only by Chinese craftsmen. European buyers paid enormous sums for genuine Chinese porcelain, sometimes mounting individual pieces in gold and silver settings as though they were jewels rather than simple tableware. It was not until the early 18th century that European craftsmen in Saxony finally rediscovered the secret of true porcelain production for themselves.
An entire industry, once dependent entirely on a single distant trade route, was eventually recreated at home through years of patient, secretive experimentation.
Even the most closely guarded secret, given enough patient curiosity, eventually finds its way into new hands. Imagine a European alchemist in the early 1700s, surrounded by failed experiments, searching for the precise mixture of clay and mineral that Chinese potters had mastered many centuries earlier. Years of trial and quiet failure finally led to a breakthrough, and European porcelain workshops soon began producing wares that no longer needed to cross the entire width of the globe. A trade route that had carried porcelain safely across oceans for 1,000 years was, in this one narrow sense, finally rendered unnecessary by patient local ingenuity. Every great trade route, it seems, quietly carries within it the seed of its own eventual replacement. Rubber, harvested from trees native to the Amazon rainforest, became one of the most transformative and, at times, one of the most troubling trade goods of the 19th century. Growing demand for rubber tires and industrial rubber products drove brutal exploitation of indigenous laborers across parts of the Amazon and, later, the Congo Basin as well. Fortunes were made quickly and ruthlessly during this period, often at a human cost historians have only fully documented in more recent decades. It stands as another sober reminder that behind a single ordinary object, like a bicycle tire or a raincoat, sometimes lies a history far harder than the object itself would ever suggest. An honest history of trade must always be willing to look past the shine of a finished product to the hands that first gathered its raw material. Imagine a rubber tapper deep in the Amazon rainforest in the late 19th century, working under brutal quotas enforced by distant trading companies more concerned with output than with the well-being of the workers themselves. The wealth generated by this trade flowed largely to distant cities and boardrooms, leaving little behind for the communities whose labor and land had made it possible at all. This chapter of trade history reminds us, gently but firmly, that convenience for some has too often been built upon suffering quietly endured by others far away. Remembering this honestly, rather than skipping past it, is simply part of telling the whole story with the respect it deserves. By the early 20th century, oil had begun to eclipse nearly every other trade good in terms of its influence over global politics and global shipping routes alike. Newly discovered oil fields in the Middle East, the Americas, and elsewhere quickly became some of the most closely guarded and fiercely negotiated trade assets on Earth. Pipelines and specialized tanker ships created entirely new trade routes, built specifically around a single resource whose importance the ancient world could never have anticipated. A substance once mostly used for waterproofing and simple lamps had, within a few short decades, become the single most strategically important trade good in the entire world. Even the humblest of ancient resources can, given the right century, rise to reshape the fortunes of every nation on Earth. Imagine an oil tanker gliding slowly out of a Persian Gulf port in the mid-20th century, its vast holds filled with a resource that would soon power engines, heat homes, and fuel journeys on every inhabited continent. Entire economies rose swiftly around this single trade good, transforming small coastal towns into major global ports within the span of a single generation. Few trade goods in history have reshaped global power quite so quickly or quite so thoroughly as this one dark and unassuming liquid. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking cargo turns out, quietly, to be the most consequential of them all. Tourism itself, in a gentle sense, grew into its own kind of trade route through the 20th century, as steamships and later airplanes carried travelers rather than cargo across oceans in growing numbers. Travelers exchanged currency, purchased local goods, and carried home souvenirs, creating a steady flow of money along routes that mirrored the old trading paths in almost every direction. Entire regional economies, particularly along coastlines once known primarily for fishing or farming, gradually reoriented themselves around welcoming these traveling strangers instead. The oldest instinct in trade, offering hospitality to a tired stranger passing through, quietly became one of the modern world's largest industries. Some trade routes, it seems, eventually carry travelers themselves as their most valuable cargo of all. Imagine an ocean liner departing a European port in the early 20th century, its passengers eager to see distant lands that their grandparents could only have read about in books. For every passenger aboard, someone on the distant shore was quietly preparing to host them, feed them, and sell them a small piece of home to carry back across the ocean. Hospitality toward the traveling stranger, once a simple survival instinct in a Neolithic village, had grown into an entire global industry built on precisely the same gentle foundation. The oldest habits of trade, it turns out, rarely disappear. They simply find new, larger forms to wear across each new century. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, digital technology added a final, quiet layer to this long history, allowing goods to be ordered from a screen and delivered to a doorstep within days rather than weeks or months. Warehouses the size of small towns now sort and dispatch millions of packages daily, guided by software tracking every parcel's journey in real time. A shopper today can, in a matter of seconds, set in motion a chain of trade stretching across several countries and multiple modes of transport at once.
The thread that once took a Neolithic trader days to carry across a single valley can now cross an ocean before the buyer has even finished their evening tea.
And yet, underneath all this astonishing speed, the exchange remains exactly what it always was: a stranger offering something needed and another stranger trusting it will arrive. Spices themselves, before we leave this part of the story fully behind, deserve one more quiet moment of attention, since so much of trade route history was quietly steered by a handful of fragrant seeds and barks. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper each grew in only a small handful of specific regions, meaning entire trade routes across 3 continents were shaped almost entirely around a few small, fragrant trees. European kingdoms funded entire fleets, fought wars, and founded colonies chasing control over these narrow, specific sources of supply.
It is a strange thought that so much of the wider medieval and early modern world map was drawn, in part, around the growing range of a single fragrant tree.
Small things, it turns out, have a way of quietly rearranging the largest maps in history. Imagine a small clove tree growing on a tiny volcanic island in what is now Indonesia, entirely unaware that its fragrant buds would one day be worth fighting over by kingdoms thousands of miles across the ocean. For centuries, this tree and a handful of others like it grew only within a very narrow band of islands, giving those who controlled the islands enormous leverage over the wider spice trade. Eventually, cuttings were smuggled out and planted elsewhere, quietly ending centuries of tightly held monopoly. Even the most carefully guarded natural monopoly, it seems, eventually loses its hold once a single determined traveler carries away just one small cutting. Nature, in the end, has rarely respected the borders drawn by any single trading empire for very long. Textiles beyond silk and cotton carried their own quiet influence across trade routes, with wool from England, linen from Egypt, and fine wool from the highlands of Peru, each finding markets far beyond their place of origin. English wool, in particular, funded much of the medieval English crown's finances, taxed heavily at every port before it left for weaving centers across the English Channel. Entire towns in Flanders and northern Italy grew wealthy purely from weaving raw English wool into finished cloth, then reselling it at a considerable markup. The true profit in this trade, time and again, belonged less to those who grew the raw material than to those who patiently transformed it into something finer. Across nearly every century we have visited tonight, the hands that finish a good have often profited more than the hands that first gathered it. Imagine an English wool merchant in the 14th century watching bales of raw fleece loaded onto a ship bound for Flanders, knowing that cloth woven from that very same wool would return, transformed and considerably more valuable, within just a few short months. Kings on both sides of this trade taxed it heavily, understanding instinctively that a nation's wealth could be measured almost entirely by the goods flowing steadily through its ports. A single sheep's fleece, in this way, quietly touched the treasuries of 2 separate kingdoms before it ever became a single finished garment. Even the simplest raw material, followed carefully enough, tends to reveal an entire hidden web of quiet economic relationships. Horses themselves were, for much of history, one of the most strategically important trade goods of all, since armies, messengers, and merchants alike depended entirely on a steady supply of strong, healthy animals. Central Asian horse breeders supplied mounts to Chinese dynasties for centuries, trading horses for silk in an exchange so significant it shaped an entire branch of diplomacy between nomadic and settled peoples. A single strong warhorse could be worth many times its weight in silk, and access to good breeding stock could shift the balance of power between entire kingdoms. Long before oil or gold reshaped global power, it was sometimes simply the horse that quietly decided which nations could field the strongest armies. Even the fate of empires in certain centuries rode quietly on four legs rather than on any throne. Imagine a Chinese official at a remote frontier market, carefully inspecting a string of horses brought by nomadic traders from the steppes, weighing their strength and stamina against bolts of silk stacked and ready for exchange. This horse and silk trade endured for centuries. A quiet, steady exchange between two very different ways of life, bound together by simple, mutual necessity. Neither side could easily produce what the other had in abundance, and so the trade continued, generation after generation, largely undisturbed by the politics swirling around it. Some trade routes endure not because of any grand design, but simply because each side quietly needs exactly what the other happens to have. Long-distance trade in enslaved people, tragically, was not limited only to the transatlantic routes we discussed earlier tonight, but existed in various forms across many regions and centuries of history. Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean networks, among others, also carried enslaved individuals across enormous distances under equally brutal conditions, a history too often left out of simpler, more celebratory accounts of trade. Naming this honestly, across every region where it occurred, is part of telling the fuller and more truthful story of how goods, and sometimes people, once moved across these ancient routes. No thread in this story is served well by leaving out its harder, more painful strands. A calm history, told carefully, still makes room for the parts that are hardest to hear. As trade goods multiplied and diversified across the centuries we have traveled tonight, so too did the sheer variety of vessels built to carry them, each one shaped by the particular waters and particular cargo it was designed to serve. Flat-bottomed river barges, deep-keeled ocean galleons, swift clipper ships built for speed, and finally steel-hulled steamships each represented, in their own era, the very edge of what shipbuilding could achieve. The 19th century clipper ships, in particular, raced tea from China to Europe in a competition where being merely a few days faster than a rival could mean a considerably higher price at market. Speed itself, in certain trades, has always been worth almost as much as the cargo it carried. Every improvement in a ship's design, across every century, was ultimately just one more small effort to make the ancient promise of trade a little more reliable. Imagine a clipper ship racing home from China in the 1860s, its crew crowding on every possible sail, competing against a rival vessel to be the very first into a London port with the new season's tea. Crowds sometimes gathered at the docks to watch these races conclude, wagering on which ship would arrive first after months at sea. The winning ship's tea fetched a premium price simply for being first, a reminder that in trade, timing has often mattered every bit as much as quality. Even a leaf as ordinary as tea, carried quickly enough, can become the subject of genuine excitement and celebration. Currency itself evolved constantly alongside these trade routes, moving from simple barter to standardized coinage, and eventually to paper notes backed only by trust in a distant, unseen authority. The earliest coins, minted in the Kingdom of Lydia nearly 2,700 years ago, were made from a natural mixture of gold and silver found in local riverbeds. Standardized coinage solved a problem as old as trade itself: how two strangers could quickly agree on the value of an exchange without lengthy negotiation over every single item.
A small, stamped piece of metal, trusted by both sides, could do in seconds what a long negotiation once took hours to accomplish.
Sometimes the simplest tools, once trusted widely enough, proved to be trade's most quietly revolutionary inventions. Imagine a Lydian merchant in the 7th century BCE examining one of the very first coins ever minted, its weight and stamp guaranteeing a value that no longer needed to be argued over with every single trade. Before this innovation, merchants weighed raw metal by hand for every transaction, a slow and easily disputed process. A single stamped coin, trusted at a glance, quietly saved countless hours across a lifetime of trading. Even now, every coin in every pocket around the world still carries a small echo of that very first Lydian innovation. As coinage spread across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, different cities and kingdoms minted their own versions, each with its own weight, purity, and design, creating a constant quiet puzzle for merchants trading across multiple regions. Money changers set up stalls in busy ports and marketplaces, converting one city's coinage into another's for a small fee, becoming essential figures in any well-traveled trading hub. This simple service, converting one trusted currency into another, would eventually grow into the vast and complex foreign exchange markets of the modern world. A humble stall exchanging coins for a small fee was, in its own quiet way, the distant ancestor of institutions managing trillions in currency today. Even the largest modern financial systems, traced back far enough, begin at nothing more than a simple table and a small pile of foreign coins. Imagine a bustling ancient port where a money changer sits patiently behind a small table, weighing coins from a dozen different cities and calculating fair exchanges with nothing but a practiced eye and a simple set of scales. Merchants relied on these figures to travel confidently between regions whose currencies they did not fully understand themselves. A fair, trusted money changer could make an entire trading career possible for merchants passing through his corner of the market. Trust, carried quietly from one small table to the next, has always been trade's true and unchanging foundation. Salt, mentioned earlier tonight in its West African context, held similar importance across many other regions of the ancient and medieval world, valued everywhere for its ability to preserve food through long winters and long voyages alike. Roman soldiers were, according to some accounts, partly paid in salt, giving us the very word salary, still used in nearly every language touched by Latin. Salt roads crisscrossed ancient Europe, some of them predating even the famous Roman roads that later expanded upon them.
A word we use every payday, without a second thought, quietly carries within it the memory of an ancient trade good that once meant the difference between hunger and survival.
Language itself, it turns out, is one more quiet thread carried down to us along these very old trade routes. Imagine a salt caravan moving slowly along an ancient European trail, its cargo destined for towns that depended on this simple mineral to see their stored meat and fish safely through the coming winter. Entire towns grew wealthy purely from controlling access to salt springs or coastal salt pans, their fortunes resting on something the earth simply happened to provide nearby. A resource this ordinary, in the wrong season or the wrong location, could mean the difference between comfort and true hardship. Even the plainest, whitest crystal on any table today once carried the weight of an entire ancient economy. Looking back across every mile and every century we have traveled together tonight, one truth quietly ties every single thread of this story into a single, unbroken whole. From a Neolithic trader carrying salt on foot, to a Phoenician sailor steering by starlight, to a Silk Road caravan crossing a desert that offers no mercy, to a container ship gliding silently into a modern harbor at night, the pattern has never once truly changed. Every trade route, however grand or humble, however ancient or modern, has always rested on the same fragile, remarkable act. One stranger trusting another across whatever distance happens to separate them. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the gentlest and most enduring inventions our species has ever made. As we draw this journey to a gentle close tonight, let your mind drift back over everything this single thread of trade has carried across so many centuries. It carried obsidian and salt between Neolithic villages who shared no language but a simple wish to trust one another. It carried silk from hidden Chinese workshops across deserts, mountains, and open seas, to Roman villas that never once glimpsed the loom that wove it. It carried gold and salt in equal measure across the Sahara, and pepper worth its weight in silver across the monsoon-swept waters of the Indian Ocean. It carried the wonder of caravanserai hospitality and the quiet ingenuity of stitched dhows, the daring of Portuguese captains and the accidental discovery of entire unmapped continents. And it carried, too, the harder truths this channel does not shy away from. The silver mined by forced hands, the enslaved millions carried across brutal ocean crossings, the workers who dug canals and laid rail lines whose names history rarely bothered to record. A trade route we have seen tonight is never only a road for goods, it is also a road for consequence, for triumph laid quietly beside cost. And yet, through all of it, that same fragile thread of trust between strangers has held, stretching now around the entire globe, carried by container ships and cargo planes instead of camels and caravels. If you are still awake, there is another quiet corner of economic history waiting for you whenever you are ready to explore it, whether that is tonight or some other sleepy evening soon to come. For now, though, let this be where your thoughts finally rest. If tonight's journey helped carry you towards sleep, consider leaving a like, subscribing for more evenings like this one, or leaving a gentle word in the comments below to let this small channel know you were here. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders sink a little further into stillness. Let your breathing settle into something slow and unhurried, like a caravan finally making camp after a long day's crossing. Picture the last light fading gently over a quiet harbor, ships resting at anchor, their cargo already unloaded, their long journey finally, peacefully done. Sleep well and good night.